husband, and he is 19 years older than I am. I'm his second wife. His first wife, Mary, died near Plainfield, Illinois. George's family came here, the Ferners and the Tobiases and the Zinsers, and they came when he was 11 years old. They came in a covered wagon from Ohio, and it took them 4 weeks to get here. We don't know why they chose Washington. They didn't seem to have any place that they were going to, but they decided to stay here. And my family is the Zinsers and the Tobiases. My father is Solomon Zinser, and my mother is Tobias. So I didn't come in the wagons. I don't know anything about it. I just know what they tell me about. And this was George when he was much younger. He was in the Civil War, and he can tell you about that.
Well, the first thing is you'll note that I was born in 1842. I was actually born on May 11th. And you can see there that I lived to be 81 years old, but what this doesn't show is that I also died on May 11th. So I was exactly 81 years old. As Amelia said, I don't really know. I was only 11 years old when the family came to Washington, so I really don't know why we settled here. But in 1862, I enlisted in the Civil War and spent the next 3 years primarily in Georgia. Was in quite a few battles. Was in Atlanta, was in Savannah, but basically all through that area. And all the time that I was there, with all the death and injuries surrounding me, I never was at any sick time. I did have a little injury to my small finger, but that was about it. And people don't know much about what I did, and so I can't tell you because none of that's written down. But what is written down is quite an extensive copy of letters. When I was in the service, I sent home letters every day, and here's some samples if you can kind of glance at them quickly and return them. They're quite they talk about, if you can see, they're quite detailed, and I was in one battle where we lost 450 men. Explain that I was in, I guess I didn't explain that I was in the G Company of the Illinois 86th, and had quite a few battles. Was very pleased with Honest Abe. We called him Uncle Abe too back in those days. Most of the men fighting for the Union were in favor of Lincoln winning the election.
That was against McClellan, you know. That was his opponent.
And I didn't get to vote. Yeah, I couldn't get home from the service to vote, but found out only a month after the election that Lincoln won, and all of us in the service were real pleased about that. Someone asked me what the size of the brigade was, and I really didn't know, but there were actually some of these letters would tell you that we had as many as 40,000 people together in some of these battles. So these were quite extensive. And saw many deaths and many people wounded and injured. So that's just basically the information that we have, and it's really, I enjoy going back and rereading these letters myself after all these years. And it brings back quite the memories.
George was a Christian man, and that was one of the reasons that I married him. He took up preaching when he was in the Civil War, and he did some preaching when he went on to school in Plainfield, and that's where Mary, his first wife, died. They had 3 children, and we had 5. All of our children are living right now. Our son is in South Dakota, but the other 4 children are here, and it's a comfort to have them nearby. We both go to the evangelical church, and I imagine we'll be buried in that church when we go.
You'll note that these letters were written to my father or my brother. We do have one or two letters that I received, but primarily it was letters that I had written that we have copies of.
My name is Mary Italin. The children in Washington called me Miss Mary because Italin was just a little bit too much for them to pronounce, and they were just starting school then. I was born in 1860. My parents lived in Peoria at the time. They were immigrants from Switzerland of French descent. When I was 18 months old, we moved to Washington, so I consider myself a true Washingtonian. I started to school at the age of 5, and I could already read because my mother had taught me at home. And I loved education. It was one of the things that I just had a passion for, and for all of my life, learning was a very important part of my life. I was in the first graduating class of Washington High School. That building is where the middle school is located today, and there were 4 of us who graduated in 1876. 4 girls, no guys. I read a speech at my graduation, and it was reprinted many years and many times over the years. It was entitled, "If Life is But a Dream, Dream It Well," and I think I did. Now, I graduated at the age of 15. In August, I turned 16, and in September, I started teaching. I had a 1-room schoolhouse, and I had 44 students in my first class. My classes over the years averaged 35 to 70 students. Yes. But the students came with a love for learning, and so I didn't have a lot of discipline problems. And if I did have a discipline problem, I know that child would go ahead on their desk. And then that was kind of their time out, and then they could pick that back up and join me in class. For my first 16 years, I taught all the grades until we were ready for high school. And then for the last 44 years, I just taught primary. And the location of my school is where the mail and law offices are, just west of Louise, and it was called the middle school. Not because of its size or its children, but because the children. Now, quickly, I made a few pieces. I was a cartoon caricature, and the headline read, "America's Most Kissed Woman." Now, I wasn't married because you couldn't teach and get married then. But the children all wanted to give me a kiss when they came to school in the morning, and they gave me a kiss when they left in the afternoon. And that was as I would crank up the Victrola, put on a drum, see so much, and they'd march out, give me a kiss, and on they'd go home to their room. Now, teaching wasn't always easy. One year I had 5 students with disabilities. One was deaf, and one was totally blind. That was a very difficult time. I remember my class sizes were at least 35. Well, the people of Washington really showed a lot of appreciation. And in 1925, when they celebrated their centennial, they also had a pageant honoring me. And my good friend, Louise Hart, and you'll visit with her later today, organized this pageant. 500 of my former students were there. I knew something was up because I was in charge of the last part of the pageant. 500 former students, and then they all stood and sang Old Lang Syne. Oh, my goodness. I was so honored. It was just wonderful. Well, there were 4 parts to the pageant. The first part, they portrayed me starting school working with my mother. On the second part, my graduation from high school, and they read my speech. And the third part was when I started teaching. And then the fourth part, I had my class from the previous year do an entertainment. I received telegrams from Calvin Coolidge on this event, from Governor Len Small, and from Senator William McKinley, who you may realize later became president. At that time, there was a large urn placed in the square, and it was filled with flowers. It was on the square and was kept. And you may have seen this picture somewhere. The urn has disappeared. Who knows what happened to it? When I retired in 1936, after teaching for 60 years, and that made the Guinness Book of World Records, the city of Washington, the children at the middle school cut my ashes pretty for years. And it's engraved in the city in honor of my 60 years of teaching. When I retired, it enabled me to continue with some things that I hadn't been able to do while I was teaching. I did a lot of reading, and I also continued to garden. Flowers were one of the things that I loved to do. My house, it was my parents' house, and then I stayed and lived in it after they were gone, is where the library is now. It was a 5-room little gray house with dark and gray shutters, and on the summer days I would shut the shutters on the Elm Street side to keep the sun out. But in the winter, I had grown poinsettias before they were a holiday flower, and so I would pin back my curtains so passerbys could come and see my gorgeous poinsettias. I also attended the Presbyterian Church, and after I retired from teaching, they talked me into teaching the primary Sunday school group, and I would put flowers on the altar every Sunday in my garden. And people said, "Oh, she's such a loyal attendee," and so forth. And she's so sweet. I also received an azalea one Christmas from David McBride, who from Hotkevich Bridge. Well, he was mayor of Peoria, and he was a former student of mine, and always let me know how much he had appreciated me. I was a member of the Washington Women's Club, and also stayed a member of the Parent Teacher Association. When I died in January of 1939, children.
Yes.
They aren't my students.
No.
Anyway, when I died in January of 1939, they closed school for the day so that my students and former students could attend my funeral. They also had a memorial service in March that was quite long and lengthy to honor me. My family received telegrams from Everett Dirksen and from Frank Toney, who was a senator in Washington, D.C. at the time. And Frank was a former student, and he commented about what an influence I had been in his life. Now, I was only survived by one cousin, but here in Glendale Cemetery, I still feel like I'm with family, because I think every child was a child, so my child is part of me. And I just really feel at home here in my home. The next stop will be Hornish, and which elementary school?
You probably had every child.
At one time, 80% of the city of Washington had been former students.
You had me in 1929.
Oh,
Did you have her?
Well, welcome. I was just taking a moment in the good book. Welcome to my little area here. Isn't it beautiful out here? My name is Mary Eliza Green, and I was born November 10, 1840 in Versailles in Woodford County. Versailles was a bustling community at the time. It was actually Woodford County's county seat. And what happened to it, I don't really know. If you look on a map today, it's not even there. I came to Washington in 1857, and 3 short years later, I married Gideon R. Hornish. I was but a mere 20 at the time. My Gideon, he was quite a man. He owned the local grocery store here in town, and in 1883, he bought what you folks now know as the Zinser home. The grocery store was located right across the street at the corner of Main and Washington. You folks have renamed that street Zinser now. I helped out as much as I could in the store, but I had 4 small children. I had 2 boys, Calla and Joseph, and 2 girls, Lulu and Mary. As was customary at the time, we named Mary after me. In 1895, Gideon fell quite ill, and he deeded the home to me. A short time after that, he passed away. This turned out to be a really poor year for me. as my beloved sister, who was married to Solomon Zinser, passed away also that same year, and I had a year of mourning. I decided to make ends meet by opening a boarding home in the Zinser house. I would have 2 or 3 guests that I would cook and that I would clean for. If you ever get a chance to visit the Zinser home, be sure to look at the stone stairway that goes between the dining room and the kitchen. It was a marvelous place to tenderize meat, and I did it frequently. My beautiful home is now on the National Registry of Historic Homes, thanks to many of your current fine Washingtonians. Later, Solomon Zinser decided he would become a boarder at my home, and I said, Solomon, that's not proper. We can't do that unless you're ready to make a commitment. He did. And we got married in 1898. Life eventually changed my name from Mary Eliza Grady to Mary Eliza Grady Hornish to Mary Eliza Grady Hornish Zinser. I was a woman of staunch beliefs and strong in my community spirit. I was president of the cemetery board, this very cemetery, until the day I died. Rather ironic, isn't it? I also was very involved in the American Red Cross in World War I. My house was used as a place to tear sheets, to roll bandages, to send across the seas to our boys. Many other civic and community groups met at my home because it was perfect for that thing. However, my true allegiance was to the church, and at the age of 12, I confessed my sins and joined the Christian church under the ministry of John Lindsley. I remember the day that I was sent up for baptism. It was cold, cold, cold. And they actually had to cut the ice on the creek before we could be baptized. My good friend George Bondurant and I frequently reminisced about this later on and how fortunate we all were that nobody caught pneumonia that day. I led a long, very full life here in Washington and enjoyed myself very much. And I'm very happy to be laid to rest here. My body is only here, however. The rest of me, my soul, the eternal part of me, is in heaven with my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I enjoyed giving you a glimpse into my life, and later on you'll meet one of my husband's descendants, Israel Zinser, and you'll hear him speak also. I know you'll find his life very interesting.
We're going to hear some information about this monument from Kit Zinser, and I understand that you're the great-granddaughter of Israel?
Yes, Abigail and I have done some research on the Zinser family, and Israel Zinser family have been here when he was like, can you tell us how he's been here?
He came covered wagon with his father, Jacob, and his mother. He was born in France, and they traveled with the Tobias, and he ultimately married a Tobias girl. He lived here continued until he went into the Civil War, and he served. He was 16 when he went in, and didn't see combat. I'm fortunate enough to live in his home, so I still have his gun that he used, but they didn't carry. He never got to use, but he carried it. It was so sad.
Did he actually see any action?
No, he didn't see any action.
After service, what was his direction?
After service, he went to Northwestern College, and that very nice couple we've been just talking about. Northwestern College in Plainfield, and went to pharmaceutical school there, and then reunited or rekindled his acquaintance with Martha Tobias and married her, and a year later had Eleanor, the oldest, and 2 years later had Harley, and he was Dr. Zinser. That's where the Historical Society, that's where their housing time at Dr. Zinser's house. He had 5 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter was my grandmother.
How did this really start getting into his life?
Well, first he had his Zinser in Hastings. He in the Plainfield area, in the Rochelle area, and he opened a drugstore. And then he came down here. He wanted to be back home. He built a home at 307, the one I live in, and he opened a jewelry store. Where Malott is right now is where the original drugstore was, and it burned down. And right next to it, where Foster Jewelry is where the jewelry store was. And he kind of did that because none of his sons went into the pharmacy business, and he needed something to keep them busy. And Harley was the only one who went to Rush Medical and became an MD, so he didn't have to worry about Harley so much. He did not spoil his boys or his daughter. My great-grandmother did that. One thing that the boys did do after the jewelry store was up and running. As a matter of fact, this bracelet he gave to my grandmother when she graduated from high school, and this pendant he gave to my great-grandmother. And they're from the jewelry store. I have a beautiful box that survived. They opened an open-air theater, the first open-air theater in the area, and they called it the Holodome, and they showed silent pictures. And they hired a piano player to accompany the pictures and tell the narrator. And it kind of led to a change in the family dynamics, because that really wasn't what Israel and Martha had planned for their children. Married piano players. Nothing wrong with piano players, but it just wasn't something that Israel and Martha had hoped. So he's not buried, Eleanor's not buried, the oldest is not buried in the cemetery. He's buried in Joyce with his wife. The Zinser boys were very venturesome and family reunions. Grace Garth, she's an elderly lady, made the comment that she wasn't allowed to play with the Zinser boys because they were all right. I just can't imagine that. Go ahead. Sorry.
What kind of a man was he? What type of a father or husband?
He was a stern man. He was all business. He was highly thought of in the community. He was town treasurer, and he was a 33rd degree Mason when he died. He had a good heart, and he was a giving man. And from the ledgers that I found at home, people owed him a lot of money, but he never collected. He was just stern with his family. He was stern with his boys, and maybe he should have been not so stern, because I think they probably went the other direction. We still have the table, and I grew up eating at that table, and it's the table that my great-grandmother and great-grandfather used for their family. And the girls were over a couple of weeks ago and had dinner with us. And even though Israel didn't allow his boys or daughter to talk at the table, I didn't like this.
Would you like to talk about these artifacts?
Yes, I would. This was Israel's hat and walking cane with his glasses. And this is a picture of Israel and Martha when they were young, when they first married. These are items that he used in the drugstore, and he was famous for his Zinserettes, he called them. Overfed by friends, take a Zinserette, no solve the problem. And I was driving to Maine this summer, and the day before I left, I lost my glasses, and I was just kind of panicky because I didn't see anything. And I put these on, and I could see perfectly. So I guess Israel and I have the same sight problems. I really feel fortunate to be in this home, and there are lots and lots of, I discovered things. I discovered things year after year after year. I can get into the attic, and there'll be a box that I haven't looked at, or letters that I haven't looked at, and I didn't know were there. And one year I was upstairs and cleaning, and I opened up a bag, a brown paper bag, and found silver items that my grandmother must have just put away because she thought they were too ostentatious. It's just wonderful. I love it. I can spend hours opening it out. I still haven't got to do it. We set it up so no one would be able to be there. I mean, other people could live there if they wanted to, other extended family members, but no one except their direct descendants would be able to find it. Carly went to medical school. We went to Rush Medical, and so Israel didn't have much to rely on when it came to having his boys involved in the business, and so that was kind of his focus. The boys, however, behind the drugstore had another little business going on, and that was the open air theater. And we hired a piano player, and it wasn't probably not what great-grandmother and great-grandmother wanted. And I think Eleanor became a little alienated from the family because he's not buried in this cemetery. He's buried in Florida. This is something that came from the jewelry store that Israel gave my great-grandmother, and then this gold bracelet he gave my grandmother when she graduated from high school. And these are his, these are his. These are pictures of him when he was in Martha was first married. And these are things that he used in the drugstore. And that's his hat and his walking cane. And last year, this summer, I was going to Maine, and I lost my glasses, and these were sitting on the table with his. And I picked them up and put them on, and I could see perfectly. So I wore them in Maine all summer this summer, and I was really worried because when I got back, I couldn't find them. And I packed the bag, and he didn't say that I did find them. I was really happy about that because they were great backup. These are advertisements from the drugstore. Israel did a lot of his own medicine, as a lot of pharmacists did, and he was famous for his Zinser. Still here kind of makes fun of him all the time, but because he saw that article at home, and I went to him with some complaint, and he said something about Zinser. It was something about if your friends overfeed you, try the Zinser. And that was what Israel really was throughout there. I think they were probably just good for a laugh more than anything else.
Right. What kind of a man was he? And how would you describe him as a father and a husband?
He was kind of a stern man. Israel, the great-grandmother's the one who spoiled the children. He didn't at all. He was stern. He didn't believe that you needed to talk at the dinner table. And that bothered my grandmother because she didn't talk to me. And the girls were able to come over and have dinner a couple weeks ago, and they sat at the table that, and I entertained at the table with Israel and his family ate at.
The girls not allowed to talk while
No, that's one thing that we noticed was different.
Yes.
Lots of conversation around that table. You know, if every word ever spoken from the time that, I mean, when Israel died, things changed drastically at the house. And, I mean, everything became a little better as far as having a good time. And I mean, he was a good man, he was a kind man, as far as, he was a 33rd degree Mason, and he was a common character for many, many years. He was a good man, but he probably wasn't all warm and fuzzy. That was my great-grandmother and my grandmother. I just feel very fortunate to be there.
Would you tell me again where the jewelry store?
Well, you know where Foster's is now? That was the jewelry store. And then it later became the pharmacy. No, the pharmacy was where Malott is now.
Oh.
The pharmacy was there and it burned down.
Okay.
And right behind, you know where the parking lot is? That was where the boys had the open air theater. Yeah. No, Harley was my great uncle. Harley was, Israel and Martha had 5 boys, and Harley was the second to the oldest boy. Yeah, it is. A lot of people think Harley was because the house, the Historical Society house, was built before our house was built. A lot of people think that Harley was the oldest. Came before Israel, but he was Israel's son. So, and he didn't, of course, move into that house until later on. He had practiced medicine in El Paso, and then he came here and bought that house. So, yeah, it's tough to keep track of. Lots of them. Harley's wife, Hattie.
Harley, but Carolyn's
Mother. Well, she was a hypo.
Carolyn and I are DARs.
Yeah, that was on the hypo side.
And your mother was Martha Jackson.
Yeah, there's 6 generations that have moved, 6 generations of Zinsers that have moved in the house. Direct descendants of Israel.
Has it always been Zinser's? Okay, so it's never been outside the family.
Yeah, Israel built the house in 1878 and nobody else has lived there except family.
Wonderful.
My grandmother was raised there, my mother was raised there, I was raised there. After my mother died, my son was raised there.
Wonderful.
I'm here to tell you about a couple of early settlers of Washington. The line to rest here. That would be the Rein family. Louis and Catherine Rein. They came to Washington back in the early growth years of Washington. At that time, they were one of the most highly respected old settlers in the area. Louis and Catherine Herman Rein came to the United States from Germany. Louis was born in Salzbaden back in 1918, and Catherine was born in Rodenhausen. The Reins were married in March of 1864 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They entered America in 1863, almost 140 years ago, coming to the United States. First settling in Pennsylvania, then after spending 4 years in the Washington, Virginia, and Pennsylvania areas, decided to move west to Illinois. In 1868, they first settled in Canton, living and farming there for a year before coming on to Washington. In the records there, I tried to check and see, but could not find real reasons why coming to Washington. The only thing I could figure out was Louis was a football fan, and figuring that Washington having a great team and background in football had to be a better place also to raise a family. So a year later, came to Washington. They settled on a farm just west of Washington, where they called home for 30 years before coming to town when they retired as life as a farmer on a daily basis. There's a display over here that when I'm done, I'll open up and let you see that shows a number of things in it. And a couple of those are the 1870 and 1880 census taken in Washington, where you can see there where their names are recorded with some of the children at that time. time. It was one of the time. The 1870 census reports that at that time they had 4 children at home. Ultimately, the marriage between Louis and Catherine had 4 boys and 4 girls, 8 children total. 1874 was a big year for the Reins, for in 1874, Louis and Catherine became naturalized citizens of the United States. Also in that year, they acquired their first official land in the United States, for what I found, and that was 200 acres purchased out in Fond du Lac Township. Coming from a family 2 generations back that were farmers, and my mother was one of the 9 kids. I can only imagine that those 8 kids living on a farm all knew the meaning of chore and duties to do well early on in life. Then later in 1890, they acquired 120 acres here in Washington Township, again, just west of town, which they owned until 1903. In 1898, the couple did stop from farming on a daily basis. At that time, they moved into town, right down the street on Market Street here, for coming in cemeteries and Packwood, and lived there for the rest of their life. As I understand it then, their son George took care of the family farm after that. And the 4 daughters, they all married names that are quite common in Washington recent history, such as the Dorwards, the Kyles, Heitzmans, and the Malotts. The couple was quite faithful in their service to the Lord. They were members of St. Mark's Lutheran Church right down the street. And like Abraham in the Bible, wherever Louis traveled and set up home, one of the first things he did was to build an altar to the Lord. He was of happy faith, a faith that gave him hope and good cheer, and a bright outlook on life. According to the records there, he was at home both at church with the Lord and also in a house of festivity where a man makes merry with his family. I'm like a good all-around type of guy. And with that, he helped clear the way for those of us who came to Washington later, making it a great place for all of us. Louis was widely known and everywhere respected. He was known for having happy words for all and an ill thought for none. Both Louis and Catherine lived long enough to enjoy a 60th wedding anniversary together. And, you know, going back at that time, 100 years ago in that, you know, 50th's a real benchmark, let alone 60 anymore. And to think at that time without the medical advances, quite an accomplishment. Louis passed away on December 31st, 1924, at his home down the street at the age of 86. A couple things I found interesting in reading his obituary is that, the funeral was held at St. Mark's, and at that time, in which would have been early January 25 when the funeral was held, the obituary was read in German, and the message was in German, which is like, what, 75 years ago. So that was, I know I've had a few comments from others that I understand it, you know, that after World War I, that German was somewhat not to been spoken that much, and to go on like that. Then 7 months later, in July of 25, at the age of 82, Catherine passed away. Her funeral was held on what would have been her 83rd birthday. It was said that Catherine was known for a rugged, buoyant, happy personality that accepted the trials and disappointments of life's burdens as they came, and she was always looking for a brighter and better future. Of those 8 children that they had more than their share of troubles and accidents. On August 2nd, 1914, just a few months after the parents had celebrated their 50th anniversary, a son George died while drowning in the Illinois River. He was at a neighborhood party up at Sandy Point, near Rome, just beside the Chillicothe. On that party, when he got looking for him, he was not to be found. He was an expert swimmer, they claimed, and went out there in the swimming in the river and never came back up. He died at the age of 40 and left a wife and 7 kids. On June 1st, 1930, a daughter, Elizabeth Kyle, died at her home in rural Washington, which I take it to be probably just west out on Centennial, would have been my guess. The family had been gone that night, and Mrs. Kyle was left home alone. The others had gone out of town on a visit. They got back after dark, seeing the house dark, thought nothing of it, thinking her to be in bed and asleep. The next morning, Mrs. Kyle, known to be an early riser and up and taking care of some of the animals and getting things going in the household. When the first got up the next morning, she was not to be seen. They went to check her room. Her bed had not been slept in. The evening before, she had evidently gone out, I guess, to tend to some of the chickens and that at the farm. The cover on the well had evidently blown off. She fell in the well and drowned in that 10 to 12 foot well and found the next day. She was 61 years old at that time. The following year, in August of 31, then a son, William, committed suicide. He was 66. In July of 36, 5 years later, another son, Louis, died in Peoria. And according to the records, it was as a result of being overcome by heat the day before. And he was 69 at that time. Of the other children, John died in 35 from a heart attack at the age of 64. Catherine Rein died in 1838 at the age of 66. Matilda, known as Tilly Rein Heitzman, died in 1936 and was 58 at the time. A couple interesting notes I saw while reading the obituary and the records that were given to me. It says, she died on a Sunday evening at her farm home after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. She had been in high spirits all day and in fairly good health until the Grim Reaper came to take his reward. Trust me, they don't read obituaries like that anymore. And the last daughter, Ida Rein-Nell, lived to the age of 92 and died in January of 73. But that's a bit of the history of the Reins as they came to Washington to settle and raise. To say, there's some pictures of the family over here, some plats where some of the Rein family has held some property over the years, and also the copies of the census back in 1870 and 1880.
Hi, I'm Louise Hart. This is my sister Eleanor.
I'm Eleanor.
Hello. And I was born in Denver, Colorado in 1883. I was the oldest of 3 girls. I moved to Kansas City, Missouri, where I went to grade school and part of high school. Then the family moved to Peoria, where I completed my high school, and then I also attended Bradley Polytech, now known as Bradley University, for 2 years and got my teaching degree. In 1907, I began teaching in a rural school near Canton. Then I moved to Chillicothe and taught there, and I became a social worker in Bloomington, Illinois for 2 years. I finally moved to Washington and taught at Liberty Central. That's the school as you go to Metamora on the right-hand side, County Line Road. There's a little white building there. That used to be Liberty Central School. I taught there, and I taught in the Hopewell schools. And I also taught at Oleo Township in Woodford County for 4 years. But I began my real career here at Washington Grade School. And this is one of the desks that I had in my classroom. Very heavy desk. In 1923, I began teaching at Washington Grade School, and I taught 7th grade for 2 years. Then I moved to 4th grade for 9 years, but my true love was teaching 2nd grade for 22 years, and I retired in 1956. Becoming a teacher was always my ambition. I felt as time went on, teaching became much more difficult. Life was more complex. We had many things as a teacher to overcome. We had radio. We had black and white boxes, television. We had movies, and worst of all, we had comic books. Families do not do things together anymore. Not like Eleanor and I did. Right. Companionship and security are lost. Mothers, you mothers in the crowd, you're too eager to do for your children. Don't drive them to school. You have them walk, because if they walk to school, they will use their legs coming to school Then they won't use them at school. Remember?
Yes.
I rarely sat during my teaching lessons. I preferred to stand, talk to my students. After teaching for many years, I began to have the children of my former students. I called the third generation of my children my grandchildren. You see, I never married, and neither did my sister Eleanor, so we really didn't have any grandchildren. But you might know some of my grandchildren. Philip Blumenschein and Bradley Ward and Charles Bradle and Susan Grimm and Ralph Rubel were some of my grandchildren. I received many gifts when I was teaching: flowers, pieces of birthday cake, and of course apples. In earlier years, wildlife gifts were given: skunks, minks, muskrats, frogs. Where's my frog? I got that one year. My frog, snakes, and lots of times they came alive. Sometimes I just got a part of a leg. I was not a fragile woman. Have you met Miss Mary today?
Yeah.
Okay, Miss Mary was my mentor. I learned so much from her, and one of the things is we always encourage students to enjoy nature. One time an owl flew into my classroom. It perched on the wire that I had across to hang up all my children's artwork, and that owl's head turned all the way around, fascinated the students. Didn't scare me at all. He could have stayed all day. Once every month, the girls brought their dolls to school, and I turned this into an etiquette lesson. They would have to introduce their doll to the class. And the boys, since they didn't want to bring a doll if they had one, they would bring their toys and demonstrate how they worked. I think I was the early show and tell person. Summer afternoons, I held an informal story hour for the neighborhood children, and Eleanor helped me do that. After retiring, work was done in my flower and vegetable garden. One of my true delights was arranging flowers for the Presbyterian Church. And in 1953, I became the first woman elder in the Presbyterian Church. I was very active at my church, and I was elected to the session and a commissioner to synod. And Reverend Tudor told a story, and you might be able to help me with this. One time, I wanted to make sure a Christmas tree was delivered.
Yes.
And didn't our car break down at that
Yes,
time?
our car did not work at all.
And so I carried, we were out in the country to get this tree, and I carried that tree to the church through the snow.
She's very strong.
Yes.
Strong-willed.
In 1956, the Louise Hart Award was established at Washington Grade School for an 8th grade student. The criteria for receiving the award: activities, appearance, attitude, courtesy, leadership, scholarship, sportsmanship, and enthusiasm. Eleanor, would you see if is a little Moss girl on there? Down here. Not Sean. No, Moss. Karen Moss received that award in 1985, and it was a $100 savings bond. And I've listed all the recipients on the list, and you can look on my list and see if you can see any other names you might know. I had a dear friend when I taught school. I told you Miss Mary was my mentor, but I had a dear friend, and that's Jean Keeley. And I sent her this note on the birth of her child. And she said, I said in my note, I said, I would like to send David William my very best kiss to be placed on the back of his neck, just below where the fuzzy hair ends. God sent you the best he had, the joy of 2 baby hands and 10 tiny toes in precious robes, imported from angel hands. I send you the best I have, a wish and a prayer true, that God will bless with happiness his dear little gift to you. Now, I'm going to let my sister Eleanor tell you how we came here. We've been together our whole lives.
Wasn't Louise great? Let's give her a
Oh, Eleanor, you're so sweet.
Well, I am Louise's sister, Eleanor Hart. I was born in Denver, Colorado in 1887. Our family moved to Washington in the early 1890s. Our father, who always had a good job, was a hotel manager, and he managed the Danforth Hotel, which was located, most of you may remember this, in the northeast corner at the Washington Square, and the Amico station is now there. So, do you remember that? Do you know where that's at now? Well, after Mama and Papa passed away, Louise and I continued to live together because we just loved each other so much. It just so happens that I love to cook. Can you tell? I'm wearing my apron today, and Louise
And I
here,
love to eat it.
Louise didn't enjoy cooking as much, so Louise would bring home the bacon and I would cook it. And Louise, why don't you tell them what you used to call me, my nickname?
I used to call her Early.
Early, because I like to wake up really early.
Early in the morning.
Yes.
I was not an early bird.
No, not at all. Oh, I just love to housekeep and to cook, and I love to host parties too. In fact, during the school year, I loved to cook so much that I would often cook for the teachers.
And then she would bring it over because we just lived right across from the grade school, and she would bring lunch over for all the teachers.
Yes, I would. Make her very popular.
Yes.
I also kept my cookie jar full for all of the neighborhood children. My favorite one to cook is snickerdoodles. Louise? Would you like to try a snickerdoodle today? My favorite recipe. My favorite one. Well, being that I am such a domesticated woman, I caught the attention of several men in the community. I called them my beaux. Well, one day I went walking with one of my beaux, and he looked over me with shock in his eyes, and he said, "I think there's something wrong. You'd better look." And I looked down, and my petticoat had come loose from its moorings and ended up all the way around my ankles. Now, you may be asking, well, what did you do?
Horrified.
Oh, it's just terribly embarrassing. The only thing that I could do, I just simply stepped out of the petticoat, I rolled it up, and I kept on walking. Louise loves that story, don't you, Louise? Another story about a beau. I'm sorry, Louise. Another story involving a beau. Most of you have met Miss Mary, is that true? You've already Miss Mary? Well, she came into the teacher's lawn very excited one day, and she had some exciting news. Recently, a young beau had proposed to her, but unfortunately she said no to the exact same man who proposed to me 2 months before.
And who never proposed to me.
I don't know why. We never did marry, no. Not only did I enjoy teaching, cooking, and hosting parties, I also enjoyed volunteering for the Red Cross during the World War. I just love taking inventory of all the different bandages, all of the different records and the knitting, and of the valentines the soldiers would receive from their loved ones. I took inventory of that. I enjoyed every stage of my life, teaching, volunteering, cooking. My family played a huge part in my life.
You can tell.
Laura, our sister, she couldn't join us today. She had other plans, I guess. Well, she lived far away. Where did she live again?
New Orleans.
New Orleans, that's right. Well, she had married and lived far away, but unfortunately she became sick. So Louise and I took care of her until she died, leaving behind a son.
She died in 49.
That's right. And Louise and I raised this child. He was just the apple of our eye.
Spoiled him rotten.
Oh, I cooked cookies for him all the time. I love my snickerdoodles. Unfortunately, he died too, leaving behind a wife and a son at a very young age. Which
we've lost contact of them. We don't know where they are today, and we've tried to get a hold of them, but we don't know where to find them.
No idea where they're at. In our last years, Louise and I decided to move. We had a friend, Miss Roselle. Remember where Miss Roselle lived?
In Peoria.
In Peoria.
We moved to Peoria.
That's right.
Kind of where we started from.
That's right. So we moved there, and Louise was the first to go. She died in
65.
I missed her so much that I followed a few months after.
67.
That's right. So
We've been here ever since.
that's right. We're known as those two giant sisters who have wonderful and interesting stories about Washington. Are there any questions that we can answer for you?
But I like your mother's better. Yeah. Would you feel lovely? Oh, what day was that?
Many of my friends called me the Colonel. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Let's let you know where that came from. I was born right here in 1889, lived here all my life. Watched them the whole time, loved it here. What I want to do today is tell you a little bit about myself, my family, and what my life was like here in Washington. My grandparents, John and Mary, they were actually immigrants from France. They came over in 1832, and they came to Woodford County. They originally came in the state of Pennsylvania for a little while. And then they came by covered wagon to Woodford County in 1834. In 1851, they bought a 320-acre farm located miles south and west of Cooper Station. It was a family farm. That's where they raised the family. They had 4 sons and 5 daughters, a large family. Youngest boy, Peter, that was my dad. Peter, Dad, he married Rachel Ingalls. She's from over in Metamora. I had 2 sisters. They both died in infancy. It wasn't that uncommon back then. And I had 1 older brother, 1 year older than me, Woolard. And Woolard is buried right here next to me. Neither of us married. We're here in our final resting place together. Woolard, he was born in 1888. He said 1 year before me. He was in the Army back in World War I. I remember in June of 1918. He was headed to that's when he went in the Army, and in November he was headed toward Europe when the armistice was signed. That was kind of his service career. He was real active locally here. He was a city alderman for years and years, served several terms. He worked over at Hiram Walker's and retired there in 1953, and then he passed away in 1971, so several years before I did. I graduated from Washington High School in 1907. I had a huge class, there were 10 of us. I graduated at that time. Then I went on to the University of Illinois, studied agriculture there, got my degree in 1912. And then I came back here to Washington and worked on the family farm for about 5 years. Then in 1917, I decided I wanted to enlist. So I went to sign up and told them I always loved horses. So I went and told them I wanted to join the cavalry. They said, we don't have a cavalry anymore. I said, well, what else you got? I said, well, we got the infantry. I said, okay, we'll do that. So I enlisted, joined the infantry. Entered the first officers training camp in May of 1917. I think it was August of that year that I was appointed a captain of the infantry. And I was assigned to the 92nd Division at Camp Grant in Rockford. There's a brochure there on the poster of that. And I was the regimental adjutant, 365th Infantry of that division. Spent some time overseas in my military career. From June of 1918 to I think it was February of 1919, I was overseas. Served on the front lines for about 3 months. And then I was discharged in March of 1919 and came back here to Washington. I was real proud of the military. I joined the Army Reserves in 1920. And then in 1927, I was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel. And that's where the colonel came from. So now you know the rest of the story on that. So I was real proud of that, and a lot of my close friends would call me the colonel. I worked over in East Peoria for the same company for close to 30 years, and I retired there in 1959. Woolard and I both always loved this town very dearly. I certainly did. I was Justice of the Peace of Washington Township for 24 years. Helped organize our American Legion Post 100. In fact, I was its first commander. Always loved to ride horses, as I mentioned, and you would see me at the front of the Memorial Day parades every year. I did that for close to 30 years. I always loved doing that. The other thing I always loved to do that a lot of people remember about me is I love to walk. I would walk 5-6 miles a day walking around town. I've been in this town since the time when the streets were first paved around the square. We only had a population of about 1,100 people until we got what we got now. And, we should be real proud of it. I've seen a lot happen here. Brother and I always wanted to give something back to the town too. We donated some land for Schweitzer Park over off of Hilldale Street. We gave that to the city. And that's a real nice park, and I know a lot of people enjoy that. I was real proud back in 1969. I was awarded Washingtonian of the Year. That was very special to me. The other real passion I had in addition to walking was reading. love to read. History, religion, philosophy, books on that sort of subject. Accumulated a lot of books. I was a member of one book club or another for over 37 years. If you're a member of a book club, you know how many books you get. When but it got to the point later on in life I wasn't able to stay in the home like I wanted to, and needed to do something with the books. So I donated over 2,000 books to the Washington Library. And they took a great many of them, and they parceled some of the others out to other libraries around. I had a wonderful life. I loved living here in Washington. I just hope you enjoy this town and treasure it as much as I did and Woolard did. We appreciate you stopping by, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
One bit of interesting information that we discovered on doing research, I saw this and I thought, well, is that an anchor having something to do with or not an anchor, but life preserver or buoy or something? And got to investigating, and there's a name, J. Harte. P-E-T-A-R-D-E, and it says Peoria, Illinois. Well, one of the people did some research on by way of the internet, and he discovered that he was a famous sculptor, carver, born in Italy in 1866. We don't know when he came to the Peoria area, but there are some examples of his work in the St. Peter's Church in Peoria, and in Bloomington, at the Illinois West End School of Music, at ISU, at the old gymnasium, and the library in Leroy, Illinois, I guess, has a number of examples of his work. But also, there are some works in New York, Mexico City, Montreal, and Paris. So he apparently was a very noted carver at the time. He died in 1942, and he's buried in Springdale Cemetery. Now, I looked at all of these older monuments of the same type, and I could not find his insignia on any of the others. But that doesn't say he didn't do the others. This one is the only one I could find his name on. The use of symbols, of course, is commonly used in the older monuments, and there are symbols on the new monuments, but not as intricate, I don't think, or as numerous as we find them here. They've long been symbols have long been a means of communicating ideas and concepts, and even information at a time when people couldn't. Now, the tree stump itself signifies life and the brevity of life, as life is cut short. And sometimes the branches broken off means that members of the family have been lost. But a tree stump also signifies immortality. Ivy, we'll find ivy on all four sides. It refers to immortality, friendship, and faithfulness. The doves, of course, we know those as a symbol of peace and purity. And then, of course, the cross, Christian faith and resurrection. The Calla Lily and the vase, majestic beauty, also marriage. And then there's the anchor. Now, that sometimes is used to symbol a career in the maritime, but it can also mean the Christian faith at rest and hope. And then the rope means eternity and binding connections to the family. Now, if you move on around to this side, we'll give you a little information about this side. Here we see Henry Schmidt, born September 15, 1854, but no death date. We'll talk about that a little later. He died in 1943. The broken wheel signifies severed family circle, and rope means eternity in binding connections to the family. Now, if you move on around, I think we covered everything on that side. Now move around here. And this plaque is for Catherine Schaubinger Schmidt with her birth date. She died, the birth date's not on here, she did die in 1932. She was the last survivor of 8 children. And this has some interesting symbols too. Christ with the crown of thorns, signifying salvation and the reward of faithful Christian. The cock, I don't know whether you can see it, it's quite small, but there is a cock up here. And throughout Christianity, the cock has meant several different things. Probably here it refers to the resurrection in the context of this symbol. And there are tools. There's a ladder, there's a peg here of some sort, a hammer, some pliers, and again a cross. Now, tools often mean power of creation, but in this context, it might mean the tools needed to take Christ down off of the cross. The Calla Lily again, marriage, love, and purity. Now we move to this side. And this says Andrew Schabinger, born November 1860, died July 22, 1913. Now, we don't know for sure, we don't have any information as to who he was. And then doubled back up and made a place for the information. Oaks, acorns, leaves, you find them on a lot of older monuments. The seeds represent potential, or acorns or seeds that are potentials. And the acorn and leaves represent mortality, strength, power, maturity. And again, the ivy here. Now, there has been speculation as to whether this is concrete or stone. We don't know, but I would rather think it's some kind of stone rather than concrete. But it is a most interesting monument.
It really is.
Any questions? I don't know that I can answer them, but
Four people are buried right before this theater. And that's what they call it,
right.
4 blocks.
I wonder when it's built.
The branches are so prominent.
Yeah.
You think back to that one. Could they be buried the way they're
because this is just the 1913. I'm sure. I feel certain this was
Put up for them.
for
Yes.
him.
And then they added those,
1913,
yeah.
I don't know. And they put the birth dates of these of
Never
Catherine
anybody
and
come back?
Henry.
Are they?
But
That was probably
Are they
not.
buried?
Well, I think it's even common today.
Yes, it is.
It is even today.
How are they buried here?
I really don't know.
I wonder if there wouldn't really be room for each side, would there? Well, there would be on most sides, but I don't know if there
Well,
would
I'm
be
wondering if it's not
1, 2,
here.
maybe
4 in a
kind
row.
of raised here.
Could be.
Maybe they come out in a spoke.
Oh, like
One, and then one that way, one on the other side, one that way.
that could work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That could be.
Yeah, this lot.
They have this whole big
That's what it looks like.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
I found it interesting. I've always been fascinated by this stone. I think it has more symbols on it than any other. I don't know whether I'm
Oh, I see some chairs down there. Is that a presentation? Good guy.
Just always
Yeah,
reminiscing remember.
That's Ruppman.
Oh, that's Ruppman down there. And smile, too.
Well,
That was it.
yeah, we're done.
We saw them all.
This is the end.
We're going to go over to
Very, very interesting. Take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.
And Joan and Walt are the first one.
Well, thank you. I hope I contributed to your knowledge.
Yeah.
You did. You did.
I'm going home.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Gloria, Eleanor. And one of the people working with the Secretary today, and discovered that we have a well-known creative software. And work for architects in Gloria and Birmingham particularly in Russia. So I kind of got a short church in St. Petersburg. And in Birmingham, I worked in school of music, and the old gymnasium, and Field, and the library in New York. And I think also executive producers in New York, Montreal, Mexico City, and Paris. So he died in 1942 and was buried in Springdale Cemetery. Now, do something else, but this is has the most symbols on it. Symbols have been utilized quite a bit on older monuments. Of course, today there are symbols too, but not to the extent, not this type of thing. And symbols long have been a means of communicating ideas and concepts and even information in a period when people did not read. The stump itself signifies life, or life cut short with branches broken off or cut off. The stump also implies immortality, and the limbs can also refer to family members. Ivy is found all over, is a sign of immortality, friendship, and faithfulness. We have the doves, which most people realize mean peace, but it can also mean purity. Cross refers to the Christian faith and resurrection. Calla Lily here in the base, majestic beauty, also sometimes a sign of marriage. And the anchor here, that oftentimes is used to signify a career in maritime, but it can also mean Christian faith, as hope, rest, and hope. We don't know whether Mr. Schmidt had a relationship with the maritime, in a maritime career. Rope signifies eternity and binding connections to the family. Now, if we move on around here, we have, and you notice that this spot hung by a rope. Henry Schmidt, born September 15, 1854.
Why would there not be a death date?
Well, I guess we this is Catherine Schaubinger with her birthday of May 23rd, 1854. And her death date is not there. She did die in 1932. She was the last survivor of 8 children. Christ with a crown of thorns, salvation, reward of Christian, faithful Christian life. And the cock up here has long been a symbol in Christianity for different meanings. Probably here, though, it has some reference to the resurrection. And there are tools here. There's a ladder, bike of some sort here, some pliers, cross, and a hammer. Tools sometimes mean power of creation, but in this context, we're wondering if it doesn't have some reference to removing Christ from the cross. I don't have that written down in any paper, but it's just a couple of us perhaps thought that perhaps that was the real meaning of that. Again, the Calla Lily, we're referring to majestic beauty and marriage and love purity. Now, around here. Here's information about Andrew Schaubinger. Now, we have nothing written down as to who Andrew Schaubinger is, but we assume that he was a brother of Catherine. He died in 1913. He was the first one in the family to die. And so we would assume that the monument was made shortly after Andrew's death. And so he put on the birthday of Henry and Catherine, but he was not around then when they died. He died before they did. The acorns are a symbol of potential because they are seeds. The leaves and the oak trees, mortality, strength, power, maturity. You see acorns are quite common. Acorns and leaves are quite common on the monuments of this period. Something interesting here, I've been trying to determine what this was. Is it a gate? No, not a gate. Somebody today suggested, and it makes sense, that what the sculptor implied was that the bark was scraped off, turned down, and then folded back up. And the ivy holds it in place. That's all the information I have. If there's any questions.